Okay, can you all hear us? So I'm Steve Daniel. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a geologist. I'm a wine buyer, and I taste a lot of wines. And minerality is something, whether it exists or not is another thing, but it's something that I like to try and find in my wines. And I've been accused of it many times in the past, saying that's definitely a Steve Daniel wine, whatever that means, which tends to be, in my view, something that displays minerality. So I've made a selection of wines here that in one way or another display minerality. Why they do it, I'm not always sure. So if anybody can illuminate me, I'll be very happy. But for me, it is almost like a feeling. I get a feeling of minerality in the wine. And there are various things that make the wine more mineral or less mineral, I would have thought, and hopefully we'll see that today. So, Jamie?
Yeah, this is a topic that I really like. I think it's very interesting. I think it's interesting on a number of levels. And one of the first levels where I find minerality to be really interesting is this, because I'm obsessed with wine itself, but also the translation of our perception of wine into words, because this is something we do in the wine trade all the time. We're describing a taste sensation, and by taste I'm using the multimodal sense of taste, which includes all sorts of inputs, including vision and hearing, and touch. And so the brain is doing something very interesting. It's combining all these perceptions that we're having from our, tongues and our nose and our eyes and our ears, and then creating this unified perception of flavor in our brains. And then what we do in the wine trade, which is very unusual, is we try to describe those in words. And it seems so normal to us because we go through wine education doing that, writing tasting notes, that we don't realize how actually abnormal it is, for the rest of the world looking in on us doing it. And so I'm really I find this concept of language and wine really interesting. I mean, how much does possessing a language of wine influence then what we perceive in the glass? And this is a big topic that I think could take up a whole day itself, this idea of how much is our perception affected by the words that we have to describe those perceptions. So minerality is this term that didn't exist in the wine lexicon until the late 1980s. I chatted to a few people who've been around the blocks for a while, Michel Batin and Stephen Spurrier, and they can't recall ever having used the term mineral to describe wines before the 1980s. And Paynode's famous book, The Taste of Wine, which I think came out in 1983, did not use the term minerality. And Anne Noble's famous aroma wheel, which came out in 84, did not have mineral there on the aroma wheel. So this is something that's come into the wine lexicon fairly recently, and I think that's really interesting. And I find myself using the tasting note a lot, as Steve has said. But it's a term that's come in for quite a bit of criticism, not least Alex Maltman's well-argued criticisms of we can't possibly be tasting minerals. And I think part of the problem is that there's this confusion between the notion of a mineral, like a rock or a hard stony thing, which is a mineral, and then mineral ions, which are dissolved mineral ions. Plants need I think there are 14 different mineral ions that plants need in order to do the jobs they do, which are taken up by the roots from the soil. And so here we're talking about two very different things that I think have got confused together. And also we have, in the world of wine, we have this Jim mentioned Gerard Bertrand and talking about tasting soils, and it's the taste of the soil. That's what I'd call the literalist position of minerality, which is quite rightly come in for some stick, because the mechanisms of how soil components could ever find their way into the glass, I think are quite questionable. And I think Lydia Bourguignon once said, I've got the quote written here, minerality is the perception of the rocks in the soil by the palate. And if you take that literally, it's kind of impossible for that to happen. But then I think mineral, and I'm talking quite a lot here, Stephen, you've probably got more interesting things to say, but I'm on a roll, that the idea of the kind of mineral being, people assume that when we talk about mineral taste in a wine, we're being literal. Yet if we talk about oh, this wine, it's very leathery, or I'm tasting cherries in this wine. We're not literally saying that the wine has cherries in it, and we're not literally saying that the wine has leather in it. So why can't we use minerality as a sort of picture language? It's very useful, I think. But then we get to the interesting question of what is it we're actually referring to as mineral, which I think this is why we have these wines in front of us, because together, and you've tasted the wines as well, so you've got your notes, we can think about, is this wine mineral? And if so, why is it mineral? So let's start with the Vidiano, Steve.
The Vidiano is Greek wine, Cretan wine. And for me, Greek wines display minerality. A lot of Greek wines display minerality. And a common theme in most of the Greek islands, with one notable exception, the common soil, predominant soil is limestone. And this wine is clay with limestone, a lot of limestone in the soil here. And grown at altitude, north-facing, and a lot of the influence of the Meltemi winds. So it's cool climate in a warm climate, if you like, and very, I think, limestone influenced. Modern winemaking, reductive winemaking, there's some thoughts on reductive winemaking and sulfide issues in terms of perceived minerality, so that may be an issue here. But what I'm tasting here is minerality, calcium, and there is lots of recent research that shows that calcium is detectable by human beings in very, very low trace elements, like 2 parts per millimole. So really low concentrations of calcium the human palate can pick up, and I'm picking that up in this wine. So
I thought this was I would have described this wine as mineral, I think. I think that, look at my notes here, yeah. Kind of one of the things I find mineral is often the palate. It's the way the palate feels. And it's kind of almost like a slight salinity on the palate. Yeah. It's almost like the way it feels in the mouth. And I think it's really interesting because I think different people, there's been quite a lot of scientists have done research on this topic. Particularly there's a group from Geordie Ballaster in Dijon who's worked with Wendy Parr, who's a New Zealander. And they've done some quite interesting experiments, and they've worked with winemakers and professionals. And what they found is that people, there are people almost have cultural mineral descriptors. So there's one group who will think mineral is something you smell. Another group think mineral is something you feel on the palate. And I think sometimes a bit of both. I know there's quite a lot of interest in the idea that some volatile sulfur compounds, that matchstick, character that you get from benzene, methane, thiol, does have quite a mineral character, and not just in the nose, but also in the mouth as well. So these reductive Chardonnays, which have become very fashionable, I think do taste quite mineral, partly because of these volatile sulfur compounds. But I wouldn't say that we can restrict minerality just to that. This one, for me, more is it's the way the palate feels. It's particularly on the end, the palate kind of expands a little bit.
Yeah, with minerality, I'm looking for that sort of length of flavour that just extends beyond, and it goes beyond the fruit. And the chap that's doing a lot of research into the human taste is a guy called Michael Tordoff, if anyone has seen his work. Michael Tordoff. It's Tordoff. And he's at Monell. He's a researcher at Monell. And he's working on all of his view is that people can taste sodium, calcium, magnesium, zinc, all of the biologically significant minerals at very small components. Yeah. I mean, certainly when you taste like something like Vichy Catalan or what's that, Pedro Salgadas, is it the Portuguese mineral water that's very salty? And I think when you taste those quite strong mineral waters, the taste of mineral is quite a strong thing. Alex Maltman argues that the mineral levels in wine are not high enough to be detectable. But then I've got friends like Gerd Stepp, who's the winemaker with Marks and Spencer, who believes that definitely that sort of mineral character, mineral ions are giving some minerality to the wines. And he cites the idea that if you cold stabilize a wine, so you reduce the potassium content of the wine, you lose some flavor. And that's his view, is that you're actually taking away some of those minerals that can contribute flavor to the wine. So the next one we're going to try is from Etna. So this is Alcantara. It's Caricanti, the predominant white grape of Etna. And it's grown at around 600 meters above sea level on the north side of Mount Etna. And again, made reductively. Common theme for me with wines that express minerality is no oak or minimum oak influence, because I think it's a kind of fleeting flavor and a fleeting, not necessarily aroma with me, more of a flavor, and it's all about the structure of the wine. And I think putting something as intrusive as a lot of oak in a wine can get in the way. So this is modern winemaking, reductive, biodynamic and organic in the vineyard, in certification at the moment. So hands-off winemaking, hand-picked, and Caricanti, but different soil. Obviously volcanic soil, a lot of sand, a lot of pumice in this particular vineyard, and some basalt as well. So slightly alkaline soil.
So Steve, do you think there's, and it's a slightly leading question this, but do you feel that you can sometimes taste, even if you're tasting blind, you could sometimes taste the main parent soil type that the wine is coming from?
I think with volcanic soils, I get more of a gut feel about it. I don't quite know what it is, but I can tend to pick up a volcanic soil, and I can tend to pick up a wine from calcareous soils, but I'd be hard pushed to go beyond that, to be honest.
What about granite? I find there's a brightness to granitic wines.
Granitic I'm not so good on. I could get confused with granite and flint and whatever, so I'm not so good on that. But certainly calcium-based soils and volcanic I can certainly pick up.
Because I'm sure to many people, this idea of being able to taste the influence of the soil is absolute heresy. But we're not positing that there's translocation of flavor elements through the roots into the grapes, then survives the winemaking process and then produces flavors in the wines. But there's a plausible scientific explanation that soil, not just soil-water relations, obviously that's very important, but soil chemistry could affect gene expression in the grapes indirectly, which would then alter the flavor and flavor precursors that are produced in the grapes, which are then transformed by the yeast into flavor compounds that we taste in the wine. But more directly, there was a really interesting study by a professor called Andrea Puke. I think it's Puke, P-E-U-K-E. He did some studies in plant pots in Franconia. So he grew vines in these plant pots. And I wish more people did this sort of experiment, because it's really interesting. So I'd like big plant pots, grow the vines in them, different soil type in each plant pot, then looked at the sap content. And the sap content was noticeably different in all different soil types. So that's kind of not a proof, but it's indicative that there could be a mechanism by which the different soil chemistries could have an effect on what goes into the grapes.
I totally agree with that. I think, the grape is 80% water, and a vine needs water to survive, and it sucks water from its environment. So if the water is in contact with some certain types of soil and picks up minerals or eroded rocks or whatever, that soil will have an influence on the flavor, if you like, just looking at it on a very basic non-scientific element, on the flavor of that water. And so I see it's... Mic up a little bit? Okay, so I see it's totally reasonable to say that the water that wine is taking up from its environment will have an impact on the flavors of the grape, and therefore an impact on the flavor of the wine. Maybe indirectly, as Jamie said, there may be a whole heap of chemical reactions that I don't understand that could end up with a different result. But I do think it has an impact.
And I know that there's some people say, well, the vine's very selective about what it takes up. But there is active root uptake, yes, but there's also passive root uptake, which is, I remember when I was a kid at school, we used to, just to show us the vascular system of plants, they got us to grow these seedlings in water, and you put a few drops of ink in there, and then suddenly the ink's taken up. It's like there is a passive uptake as well. Plants don't need ink, but they take it up. It's dissolved in the water. So I think it would be really interesting to have some more precise studies on this. Because I think that some of the protests from the scientists, and obviously I come from a scientific background, are a little too strong, and they're just like, oh, it can't be possible that wine's a mineral. But that's what we're tasting. And I think the other thing I'd say is that we're living in an age where winemaking, I think, and what we celebrate in wine has changed a bit. And when I started drinking wine, when Steve was, the head honcho at Oddbins, I used to go to Oddbins and buy all the things he'd bought. But I remember there's a lot of, even like when Le Cave de Perrine started out, they were celebrating the big burly wines of the Southwest. There wasn't these glue light-coloured reds that Le Cave was selling. It was like inky dark Southwestern monsters. And we were into these big wines that had lots of flavour. And I think now it's, you're seeing a lot more wines on the market, like lighter reds and whites that have been made very sensitively, picked early, which is where I think you're seeing more of these mineral flavours coming out. And I think maybe the other thing, I've talked too much. The other thing is that, perhaps what we're talking about as mineral is the stuff that isn't the fruit. Because we love fruit, we love all different fruit descriptors, it's great. But actually, I think that the older I get, the more I'm into non-fruit components in wines that are ethereal, transparent, detailed, and I think that's suddenly where we encounter the need for descriptors like mineral.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think when I started buying wine, finding wines that were faultless was a major task, and also I think the winemaking in those days was a little primitive in sometimes, and oxidation was a big issue. Now with reductive winemaking and people's the fashion of what people want to taste changing, I think we will get more descriptors which are mineral. I think that kind of delicate wine will become more to the fore. So I think the word mineral will become more apparent. I think if you have big oaky wines, you don't get minerality. If you have big aromatic wines, you don't see minerality, shall I say. You may get it, but you don't see it. And these wines are more on the modern take, and you see this sort of mineral element. I mean, the next wine we're trying is another volcanic wine, but this time it's from Campania, and the soils there are richer, and they're more varied. You have basalt in the vineyards, but you also have marl, which is a clay with limestone.
Are we on the Campania or are we on the Tenerife?
Sorry, I missed the Tenerife. This is Campania.
Okay, so it's
I will go
Campania,
back to Tenerife. So you've got a combination of volcanic soils in this and limestone. So it's quite complex. Again, it's made in a reductive style, so I think that minerality again really comes through in my view anyway. It has a length of flavour which I always associate with this term minerality as well. You very rarely get a mineral wine that's short in flavour.
So I guess a lot of this is about experiencing how thinking about how we experience the wine in our mouths and the feel of it, and also the finish as well, how the finish works.
Yeah. I mean, this could be. There's another field of thought which is, I think, was researched in South Africa, which is that this minerality that we're seeing is to do with an increase in succinic acid in the wine, and succinic acid, when you put it in isolation, is quite unpleasant. It has a sort of dry mineral flavour, and key, it has a very persistent flavour. And I think Peno mentioned it back in the day, saying succinic acid is responsible for a wine's vinosity, if you like, that length of flavour. And there are various things. The succinic acid is primarily produced in the fermentation. Basically, it's the yeast action creates this dioxalic acid, which is succinic acid. But there are various things that you can do to increase the succinic acid of wine. And one of the things that a lot of these wines, which I haven't mentioned, because they're fermented in stainless steel, spend a long time on their lees. And one of the things that has been seen to increase the level of succinic acid in a wine is long lees aging and high level of solids. There are more winemakers especially with white wines, fermenting with a higher level of solids in the wine. So it may not be minerality, it may be succinic acid, but who knows? It's just another one of those things that's coming up. But it's a kind of flavour that I like, so that's another thing to throw into the discussion.
Yeah, I also like salty wines. I'm really into salty wines. I think I think there was some discussion with Rundle Graham on Twitter recently about adding salt to wines. Well, I guess the Romans used to put salt in wines, didn't they? So it's like there's a salinity, I think, that is really, I find very, very attractive in, especially, well, mainly white wines, I'm thinking. But it's interesting because when we talk about minerality, often we're talking more about white wines than red wines. So I presume this is because of the fact that often the stuff in red wines that's the non-mineral component can often be quite strong.
I totally agree. To be honest, I find it very difficult to find minerality in a lot of red wines. It's something that I get mainly in white wine. Some red wines here, later on, hopefully you'll see some minerality, but I don't know whether that's because the wines are displaying minerality or the way they were made is displaying minerality. So we shall see. So I've just poured Viñatigo from Tenerife, another volcano. This is from the north side of the island, and this is Listan Blanco. I could have chosen a Marmorjuelo or a Gual or a Vicariego, but those wines tend to be quite full-bodied and more aromatic. And again, as I said, aroma and full-bodied wines don't display minerality as much. Listan, as you probably all know, is Palomino, much denigrated in many parts of the world, saying it's low acid, not interesting, dull grape, but I think it works pretty well in Tenerife. It's volcanic soils again. It's from the north, so it's more basalt again. Again, slightly alkaline soil in this case, and I think it makes really quite an intriguing wine. Deliberately, also, it's a 2017, so it's playing down on the aromatics to show that a grape like Palomino can still show some minerality, and it's picking it up, I think, from the volcanic soil.
Would you say that some varieties seem to be better at producing mineral wines than others?
I would say some are less good at doing it than others. I think the type of grapes that do it are non-aromatic. So if you think of the great wines that show minerality, I would say Acertico is probably prime, but that's a combination of things: one, the grape, and two, where it's grown. I think Chardonnay, it's difficult to show Chardonnay and minerality because it is so rich, and it will tend to get in the way. So I think indigenous...
What about Chablis, though? Chablis is often held up as a test case of minerality in wines, isn't it?
But it's one of the few wines that I don't find minerality in.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I don't find it in Chablis, and whether that's because in recent years the vintages have got warmer, and therefore the grapes have got riper, and I don't see it. I see it in... there's one producer I do see it in, and that's Pew's, who, when I taste his wines, they are, to me, classic mineral Chablis, but I find it in few wines from other people. It's a bit like in the past, Puy-Fumé, or Sancerre or whatever from Silex, I would have said mineral. In recent vintages, I don't see that. I don't see it because maybe the grapes are riper, or I don't know.
Yeah. No, I guess in Jura I find it more sort of like with some of the natural guys like l'Abbé or Ganevar, long aging without sulfites, but really, really low pH. They tend to, that with a couple of years in barrel, I think they tend to get this lovely, what I call crystalline mineral character. But I see what you're saying about,
Okay, so on to mineral, I think. Thalicitis, which is white wine from Santorini, 100% Acertico. I think you all here know about Santorini. It's volcanic. It's a very young volcanic island in terms of its geology. It's 3,500 years old, so that's yesterday in terms of geology. Very different volcanic soil to the rest of the wines we've shown from volcanic areas. It's basically pumice and sand. That's what it is. And a product of that is aspa, which is a sort of like condensed sand and ash, basically. So there's no soil here. I mean, there's one of the theories that vines pick up whatever they're doing from soil. There is no soil in Santorini. It's basically ash and asper. So what's happening here is that the vines have got very deep and old root systems. Some of the oldest vineyards in the world, if not the oldest. No phylloxera. Interestingly enough, it's an acidic volcanic soil. The pH is it's slightly no, it's not. It's slightly alkaline. So I think it's 8.2. Yeah, it's 8.2 from memory, and it produces grapes that have incredible high acidity. And one of the reasons of that is that Acidico has high acidity anyway. But the other is that unlike all of the other volcanic soils that we've had here today, is it doesn't have any potassium. There's very, very low potassium in the vineyard here, and apparently if you have low potassium, you get very high pH in your must. So you have an 8.2.
Do you mean the other way around?
It's
more acidic.
Very
high
acidic.
Acidity,
Sorry,
so
high
lower
acidity.
pH, higher acidity.
That's true. Yeah. So it's about 2.8.
2.8 is insane. Yeah.
It's insane. It's as low as you go, and so really acidic wine. So this to me is volcanic. It's also salty. Jamie mentioned salty. It's salty because a lot of the water that the vine gets on this island is actually from sea mists, and a lot of that then goes into the soil and is taken up by the vine. It's also coating the grapes themselves, so you're getting this saltiness in the wine. So it's salty and mineral.
I just said this is benchmark mineral. Tasting through these wines, it's just like, whew.
It is. Yeah.
It's a pretty spectacular wine. Do you think that there's a correlation, or maybe sometimes even a confusion between acidity and minerality? Do you think sometimes when people say this wine is mineral, what they're actually saying is it's got very high acidity?
Yeah, could be.
Yeah.
No, it's a fine balance, I think. Yeah, definitely. But this is, to me, I taste. I know Santorini very well, and I taste and smell Santorini in that wine. So it really is. It's that soil that you're tasting.
Cool.
Okay. We're going to move on with the wines a little quicker, I think. I don't know how we're doing for time, but so we're going into the New World now, which the first excursion. I mean, historically, I suppose New World wines have not really been shown to display minerality, if you like. But this wine is an interesting wine. It's from a guy called Matthias Riccitelli, who's a young guy making waves in Argentina. He's all about expressing his terroir. This actually is from 3 different terroirs. The Sauvignon element is from Topongato, Gualtelare, so limestone soils and alluvial rocks up in the high Andes. The Chardonnay is from sandy soils, and the Semillon is also from sandy soils. But unlike the others, this is wild yeast and also in eggs. So finally an outside influence. So this is fermented in concrete eggs, and you could say that the minerality in this wine could be in some way from the concrete eggs that it's fermented in. But I think it's still a mineral wine.
Yeah, and I find often with whites that have been fermented in concrete, you often get this sort of slight stoniness that may have something to do with the concrete, but I think it's really interesting. I think it almost gives a little bit of structure to the wine and a focus, I think, of all the different flavors. And I'm quite taken by concrete. And also clay as well, but clay's another. We're going to come to that later, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah. But I think it's a really mineral wine.
This is a spectacular wine, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So into France and Gérard Bertrand, we mentioned him earlier on. So biodynamic. So no added fertilizers here, because I think one of the things that Maltman says that I totally disagree with. He's saying if there is any minerals in the wine, it's coming from added fertilizer. So I'm not so sure about that personally. That's not something that I would say that would be relevant in an organic wine and a biodynamic wine, maybe in a mass-produced wine, but I've never seen a mass-produced wine that displays minerality. So I think putting man-made fertilizer in the soil isn't a way to minerality.
Yeah. And this, just to interrupt, there's some really interesting, I don't know if any of you come across Mimi Castile. She's Oregon wine grower, very smart person. She's there's a really interesting YouTube lecture from Mimi where she talks about the effect of glyphosate on mineral availability in soils, because glyphosate, the herbicide that's come under a lot of stick, initially that was invented as a chelator for industrial pipe cleaning. Because what it does is it just a chelator is something that it comes after the Greek term for chlor. It's a molecule that just grabs hold of other molecules. And that's how glyphosate has its effect. It targets a pathway called the shikimic acid pathway, and only occurs in plants. So that's why they thought it's a miracle herbicide, because we don't have it. So it's totally safe for animals, or so they think. But what it does is it grabs holds of ions, mineral ions, and it's quite unselective. And so there will be some glyphosate in the soil, residual glyphosate in the soil if it's being used on the vines, or the weeds, in the vine row. And it just grabs hold of molecules, doesn't let go of them. So it really affects the nutrient or mineral availability to the plant. But she's got an hour-long lecture. It's on YouTube. It's really worth watching. It's very interesting. Because I think there's this discussion of, do you see more mineral wines from vines that have been farmed organically and biodynamically? And I think there's really a case to be made for this, partly because the microbial life is very important in releasing and making bioavailable all these nutrients in the soil and these minerals in the soil. So I think this is an area which I think is really interesting. And of course, there are some people who've got very polarized positions on this, and you'd have to go in there with a slightly critical mind. But this is interesting work that I think is questioning some of the approaches to viticulture in the past and backs up some of the claims made by people who do farm with more respect for the soil. And that's one of the reasons maybe why the wines just taste more interesting.
Yep. So this wine is a blend of Grenache, Vermentino, Viognier, and something else. And it's grown on limestone, predominantly limestone. And but I think it's a mineral-based. It should be a mineral wine. It's low yield, hand-picked, and on limestone. But it has a proportion of it fermented in barrique. So that oakiness, I think, maybe is detracting a little bit from the minerality.
I think it's a slight mask, isn't it?
Exactly.
I think if they picked a tiny bit earlier, not that I'm suggesting they know what they're doing, then they sell their wines, I'm just an idiot. But I think if they picked a little bit earlier and didn't use so much of that makeup, then you probably would get a much more mineral wine. Not that I'm suggesting that they're doing anything wrong. This is, they know their market, and
absolutely,
that's just my.
Yeah, I think it's a really complex and really interesting wine, and minerality isn't the only arbiter of quality. I don't think it's just one thing that we're looking at today, and I think it's a really good quality wine. But I think if you took that wine and the components and didn't put the oak on it, you'd see the minerals shining through on that.
Yeah.
Okay, and the last wine is.
Are we going to
the Salva Kiir from Ribeiro, from around the village of Gomariz, and this is a guy called Excel Sevio, who's a little bit of a maverick in the region. Only works with really old vines, only works organically, looks for minimum impact, and this is from schist and granite soils, and wild yeast, minimal interference, if you like. He does put it through barrels, but they're 500-litre barrels, and they're predominantly used third-year use. And I think, again, shows minerality and maybe a bit of saltiness.
And there's some skin ferment here as well.
And skin ferment as well, yeah.
Yeah, this is, for me, this has a little salinity, a really nice salinity. It's a wine of contrast because there are richer elements, and I think that's sort of like that citrus peel, dried citrus peel from the skin contact, and then there's this lovely sort of like saline twist as well. I think that definitely counts as mineral. We should be doing a ranking, shouldn't we? Minerality. It should be a part of a scoring system. Cranky scoring systems like weirdness, minerality. I don't know what else. It could be quite fun.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to go on to the reds now. As I said, I find it difficult to find minerality in a lot of reds, and it's not, again, it's not an arbiter of quality. There's amazing red wines out there, and just because they're not mineral doesn't mean that they're great quality. But it's I think maybe as there is a shift towards lighter red wines as well, I think, and less influence from new oak and new barrels, I think that there might become more minerality, or what I see as perceived minerality in reds. So the first wine is brand new wine, actually, just come out. It's a new concept, if you like. Dirk Nijport, I think, coined the phrase Nat Cool from the wines from Portugal, and this is a Nat Cool, but not from Dirk. This is from the south, from Alentejo, and it's indigenous varieties grown in granite and schist, wild yeast, skin contact, and fermented in amphora. So, and also picked quite early. So, as I was saying about this less alcohol, so this is, I think, 11.5. So, to me, this really does show a minerality, and whether the minerality is coming from the schist and the granite or from the amphora pot is up to us to decide, but it definitely shows minerality in my book. Yeah,
because the Alentejo has quite a strong tradition of, especially in the south, of using these things called tallias, which are big, huge old amphora, I guess. But unlike the Georgians, where the Kvevari are sunk into the ground, these are above ground. And there's been quite a revival in them. I went to Talia Day, which wasn't just Alentejo people, but people making wines in clay from around the world in November. And there's a real revival of people working with this way of fermenting and aging wine. So all the Talia in Portugal will be pretty old ones now. They don't make them anymore. And there's quite a market for them now. A lot of people would have had one at home and would have made home consumption wines in them. So there's a lot of people hunting around to try and find them, because they do make really interesting wines. And I think it's a way of making a red wine without oak, that yet allowing that wine to have some dimensions and detail and complexity. Because if you just make red wine in stainless steel, you often just get nice fruit and not a lot else. But the Talia or the amphora is a way of doing that. In Portugal, they don't really seal them. They just stick a layer of olive oil on the top, and then they cover the top to stop flies getting in, which is kind of interesting. And the other thing is they're always lined in Portugal with this substance called pash, which is like a combination of resin and beeswax, and everyone's got their own formula for it. And sometimes there's a taint called the taste of pash. So if it's not done very well, you can almost taste it in the wine. But I think this wine's super interesting, light, and this Nat Cool idea that Dirk started, he's doing with his own wines and then collaborating with other people. There's one from Suertes del Marquez that has Nat Cool there from Tenerife. The idea is wines that are not expensive, that are super drinkable, reds and whites, and they're all sold in these liter bottles with a crown cap, which is, I think, fantastic. It's a fantastic concept. So, yeah. There's a sense of playfulness about them as well. These are wines not to... I think there's complexity to this wine, but it's a wine for drinking.
Okay, so we're going back into the New World. So again to Argentina, funnily enough. And this is Juanpe Michelini's project. This is the Ego range from Zorzal. And so this is Malbec, again grown at altitude. So it's mainly alluvial soil, but also again with some rocks in the soil, and also a high proportion of limestone, and basically very natural winemaking, natural yeast, a little bit of obviously skin contact because it's red, but also then goes through concrete, and so the eggs again. So winemaking is playing a role in this minerality, if you like, on this wine, and I think it's a really interesting take on Malbec, high altitude Malbec, very different from your standard valley floor Mendoza Malbec from Argentina. So lower alcohol, more restraint, I think more minerality, more nervosity, if you like. It's definitely a more vibrant wine than a lot of the big fruit bombs that you can get from Argentina.
Yeah, it's very interesting because in Gualtagerie, where this is from, when they say there's limestone in the soil, it's not like ocean-derived limestone, like with seashell-derived limestone. It's actually pedogenic lime, so it's a feature of arid climates where you get this accumulation of calcium carbonate layers, often in a pan in the soil, and they often form around the rocks, which is very interesting. So the rocks have got this white crust around them, and that's the limestone influence in these soils. And I think a lot of the guys who are making really interesting wines have been finding those vineyard blocks that have got these. And I did a comparative tasting out there looking at different levels of limestone with the same grape variety in neighbouring vineyards, and it was really interesting. It was this influence of the soil on wine flavour, I think, is one of the most fascinating things. It's one of the hardest things to parcellate out and investigate, but I'd love to start doing some really rigorous comparative tastings, just trying to, with a group of people, just looking at this, trying to kind of unencode this sort of the link between soils and flavour, because that's one of the most interesting things in wine, I think.
Good.
And this one, I think, has got a mineral core to it, but it's also got quite a ripe fruit impact that I think the minerality, you can still taste it through that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It has got fruit. I mean, it has a rich fruit, but there is that mineral core and that sort of freshness on the finish. It finishes not tannic. It finishes fresh. It's kind of, you can taste the limestone, that kind of chalky finish, I think.
And it seems that the wine is no one's trying to make the foot fit the slipper here. Because I think you can always pick earlier, and you end up, sometimes I think with the modern trend for picking earlier, you can end up in a position where you're making a wine of style rather than a wine of place. It's like the pendulum swung so far that suddenly it just tastes of an early picked glue red.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think this does taste of where it comes from.
Yeah.
I mean, you get in the area and you can taste it. You can feel it. So we're moving on to the last wine. I think we're probably 5 minutes from wind up. So this is Chateau Trotligot, which is Cahors. And this is an interesting wine, I think, made in a very natural way. The soils here are very iron-rich. It's sort of clay with lots of iron and limestone again in the soil. No added yeast. A long soak on the skins. Fermented in unlined concrete tanks, and I think funky, natural, if you like. There's not messed around, but shows to me minerality.
For me, this is kind of funky, but I like the sort of funkiness. Is the dominant character there reduction or Brett, or is it a bit of both? It's like, there's definitely, without chemical analysis, I couldn't say for sure, but I would definitely say that has characteristics of both, but I wouldn't say it was faulty necessarily. I think an Australian winemaker or a New Zealand winemaker would absolutely spit it out and curse the winemaker, but I think that's being a false policeman. Sometimes I think this sort of wine with those, it's got lots of fruit there. It's got a sort of multi-dimensional sort of characteristics. It's a bit wild. It's a bit bloody. It's a bit animal. But it's like, I would certainly smash a bottle of that.
Yeah.
And I do think part of that reductive character does contribute to the sensation of minerality there. That's
Absolutely. I think it definitely has that sort of, as you say, minerality coming from the slight reductive thing. There is a lot of Brett in there. I'm very Brett sensitive, and that's got a whole heap of Brett, but you kind of can tolerate it in there. But to me, it does have that sort of iron, bloody kind of element to it, and it's the soils here are limestone, which gives that freshness, and iron, a lot of iron in the soil.
I love tasting iron in wines. That sort of rusty nail blood. Like when you bite your lip or something, and you can taste the blood. I'm not a vampire, but there's something that's like, oh, that's really interesting. Yeah.